These 3 months of practices have been exceptionally intimate, powerful, and overwhelming in a good sense for me. The Lord has revealed himself to me in a way that I did not expect. What I mean by this is that I have felt an intimacy with our Lord that I have not experienced since the time around when I was saved. Every movement reminded me of the fact that I live in this world, but I am not of this world anymore. This was a truth and a reality that God revealed to me when I was saved, but also now when we entered into communion.
Welcome to the Follower Podcast,
a place for conversations and ideas on how we follow Jesus to the depths of his heart and the ends of the earth.
Follow is a community of learning and practice in the way of Jesus.
You can find out more about resources, events, and how to get involved
by visiting www.wearefollower.com
or finding us on your social media platform of choice.
We hope you enjoyed this episode with your host, Matthew Lewis.
Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. Hope that you enjoyed last week and that it gave you a lot to think about and encouraged you in your practice of communion. If you don't know, we're in the second episode of a 3-part episode where we are revisiting our communion focus, which was a 3-month journey that we did through the practice or the devotion that we see in the early church, Acts chapter 2:42, the breaking of the bread, communion, Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, all of these rooted in the same idea. And we looking at communion from the 3 angles of encounter, remembrance, and expectation. Last week we looked at a very high 30,000-foot overview of really encountering Jesus at the table. And there's a complementary practice that goes with that, where you go through the story of the road to Emmaus and how people's eyes were opened to see Jesus in the breaking of the bread. So if you wanted to find that practice, you could go to www.wearefollower.com and you'd find the practice there under the communion focus. This week, we are looking at communion from the angle of remembrance. And our friend Langa Mbonambi from We Will Worship, he leads us through the Exodus narrative and Passover and how communion is linked into that tradition and what it means for us to be people of remembrance as we're invited into the story of Jesus. And so I hope that this talk is helpful for you. It certainly was for me.
Greetings to everyone. It's really cool to be invited to chat and to share on this, probably one of my favorite subjects. So I'm trying to change my screen so I could see. There we go. This is definitely becoming one of my favorite subjects to talk about. And so the challenge with it is just figuring out what to say and what not to say, because there's just so much to say about it. This is a really cool journey that you guys are on. I so appreciate Matt. I've said this to him. He's incredible with words. And what I appreciate about his kind of ministry journey is that, it's all about following Jesus. And we can do so much in life, get busy with so much. I grew up in a space where it's just like plant churches. And then I got to a point where I realized that, Jesus never says we must plant churches, but we must make disciples. And that it's all about learning to be better apprentices of Jesus and followers of Jesus. So I even just love, the follower and all that he's doing with the follower. And anyway, I can go on about him because he's my friend. He's my boy. Anyway, with regards to this topic, as I said, I think there's just so much that can be said about it, about Passover, communion, and but the one thing I think that was just on my heart for tonight is the theme of remembrance. because I think that is kind of at the heart of it. And in Luke 22:19, Jesus says that we must do this in remembrance of him. And often I think when we think of the remembrance of him, it's just holding up the communion elements. But it's more than that. It's not only the communion elements, it's how it was actually also done. It was the community that was around the table. It was everything surrounding that moment that we're called to do in remembrance of him, which is so much more than just a cup of wine and a wafer, but it was more about a lifestyle that we're called to do in celebration and in remembrance of him, and him being our Passover lamb. And so when I was reflecting on Passover, is that a key part of Passover is the aspect of remembrance. And the Lord speaks about this when he institutes the Passover, is that it was something that was to be remembered over generations until we actually got to the place where Jesus showed up on the scene. But a big part is remembrance, in that as humans, I realize, man, we forget so quickly. And in knowing that, even just reflecting on my own, personal journey with Jesus, maybe, trusting Jesus for something, maybe there's a need and you pray and you wait and you trust in God and God pulls through, right? And then the same need comes up a month later, and then all of a sudden you're freaking out and you're like, God, where are you? And it's like, but it's the same God that came through for you a couple of days before, but now that another challenge comes up, all of a sudden your faith has waned, and I just always get the sense that we're these fragile beings, and we are temperamental, and it's often because we tend to forget. We tend to forget who God is. We tend to forget what God has done. And so the Lord institutes these things, and he puts these things in place to cause, to teach and train our hearts to always be remembering who he is and what he has done. And so Passover is a key part of that, and what he instituted, especially for Israel as they were being trained to worship him. Anyway, so the whole story, I mean, where Passover was officially instituted is in Exodus, and you have the statement. I mean, I'm guessing most of us know the history of Israel, in that they came in as Jacob's family into Egypt, and after 430 years. A bulk of those 430 years, they were in slavery. And the time came as they cried out to the Lord, and the Lord came then, and he began to unfold his plan for them. And so in Exodus 6, you have God coming in and remembering his promise over Israel. And there he begins to give these 4 statements, which are known as the 4 statements of Exodus, which is a key part of Israel's history now today. So God comes in, he comes to them, they've cried out to him, and he says that in Exodus 6, he speaks over them, he says that I will call you out, I will rescue you, I will redeem you, and I will make you my people, and I will be your God. And so you have these 4 statements that I will call you out, I will rescue you, I will redeem you, and I will make you my people. And the important thing to recognize in these statements is that God was calling Israel out so that they can worship him. And so redemption, as I've studied the scriptures, always ends in worship, in a full expression of worship. And so even when God calls Moses to go speak to Pharaoh, he says to Moses, go tell Pharaoh to let my people go so that they can worship. Or in some translations, they would say so that they can serve. And so redemption always ends, or deliverance always ends in worship. That's always what kind of the final state is so that we could fully worship God with everything that we have and with everything that we are. And so God comes and speaks these 4 statements, and then he begins to roll out the plagues. And when it comes to the 10th and the final plague, he then starts to speak, to say that he's going to rain judgment. Sorry, let me just flip to the text. I forgot my actual Bible at home, so I'm using a cell phone, which I'm not a fan of, but hey, maybe I'm just old school like that. And and he begins to speak about the Passover, and that's found in Exodus. I'll read from Exodus 12, and says this: the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall be for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you." So in actual fact, in one of the calendars of Israel, even today, the Jewish calendar, it begins with the Passover. That's where the year begins, which is quite significant, that they would begin with this significant moment, and that every year they'd come back to beginning their year with this significant moment. Then it reads, "Tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, every man shall take a lamb according to their father's house, and a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for a lamb, then he and his nearest neighbor shall take according to the number of persons, according to what each can eat. You shall make your count for the lamb." This is such a significant, when I was reflecting on this, is that you're to take a lamb and look at your family, whether or not you guys would actually finish the lamb together. Or if not, then you need to gang up together with other people. And it just speaks of community for me, is like knowing where the families are. Can you imagine people saying, okay, numbering each other and gathering together with other people and coming together? So it's not supposed to be this just me and Jesus thing, but it's definitely from the onset, it was supposed to be a community affair, a community meal, where we're aware of the people around us and their standing and their family, where they are, and gathering together to celebrate this feast together. And then it speaks, "Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male a year old. You shall take it from the sheep or from the goats, and you shall keep it until the 14th day of the month, when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lambs at twilight. They shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the flesh that night, roasted on the fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They shall eat it. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roasted, its head with its legs and its inner part. And you shall let none of it remain until morning. Anything that remains until morning you shall burn. In this manner you shall eat it, with your belt fastened, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover." So he gives like specific instructions on what they need to have, the different elements, so that to take a lamb, they need to roast it over the fire. It was a very specific instruction, not to boil it, not to eat it raw. And then they're also to take the blood of the lamb and smear it on the doorposts of their homes. And then they're also to eat it with unleavened bread, as well as with herbs. A significant thing to note here is that it's only in Passover that unleavened bread is eaten, and so whenever you actually see unleavened bread being mentioned in Scripture, it's making reference to Passover, to the Passover meal, or the actual feast of Passover. And then also was also to be eaten with bitter herbs. And then in verse 12, he says, "For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord." The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you or to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. This day shall be for you a memorial day, and shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations, as a statute forever. You shall keep it as a feast. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove the leaven from your houses, for which if anyone eats of what is leavened from the first day until the seventh day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. Okay, I'll pause there. So the Lord says, that he's gonna pass over, but where he sees the blood, he will pass over. This is the Lord's Passover. And so we celebrated something that we celebrate with our community, and so one of the things we actually raised was that someone asked was that if the Egyptians also kept the Passover, were they also exempt from the judgment? And we came to the conclusion that it was simple. If they did, it meant that they put their trust in the God of Israel, and that death would have also passed over. And also conversely, if the Israelites didn't smear the blood, would death have come into their home? And the answer is yes, because God gave them the specific instruction that if he saw the blood, then death would pass over. And so it just speaks to one is just trusting in God and trusting in God's ways, and then also just simple obedience for us to be people that follow God's instruction to the T. When God speaks, we need to obey and do as he instructs us to do. And so they couldn't kind of rest on their heritage in being Israelites and saying, oh, okay, if I'm an Israelite, then, what's going to happen to the Egyptians? It's, I'm going to be exempted from that. But just simply that, hey, let us follow God's instruction to the T. And I think that's so significant for us as we follow Jesus, is to follow, to obey, to walk in obedience and trust God as he speaks and he instructs us. And so the different elements that are in the meal there's the lamb. And again, the lamb was supposed to be whole. They weren't to chop it up or break its bones. It was supposed to be eaten whole and roasted over the fire. And then the other element is the unleavened bread. Leaven represents sin. Part of it being unleavened bread was so that they could leave in haste. So they wouldn't wait for the bread to rise. But significantly, leaven represents sin or decay. And it was significant that they were to have unleavened bread for this particular meal. And then later on, and then the other element that was added was herbs. And then later on in Exodus, it explains why these elements were to be in the meal. And so the unleavened bread, again, as I said, represents sin, but it was also represented affliction. It's also known as the bread of affliction. It was supposed to remind them of their affliction under their slave masters in Egypt. And then the bitter herbs was also there to remind them of the bitterness of slavery that they experienced. Remember, the Passover was something that was supposed to be celebrated every year at the beginning of the year. And so these elements were there to serve as reminders to them of what they were coming out of, unless they would forget where they were coming from or what they were coming out of. And again, that's why, this theme of remembrance is so central to the Passover. And so as we know, God then came and delivered them. and they left at twilight after eating the meal. What I love about this meal is that whilst they were in their homes, covered by the blood of the Lamb, death was reigning over Egypt. And so in the Egyptian household, where there was no blood on the doorpost, there was death, sadness, weeping, and mourning that was happening. But yet in the home of the Israelites, or everyone that had the blood smeared on the doorpost, there was celebration and feasting. And it's like this contrast of these two worlds happening simultaneously. And so even as whenever we partake of this Passover, is to fully embrace the celebration that we get to experience in the Lord. And sometimes I think, as believers, we withhold the joy that we have in the Lord, all for the sake of not trying to seem like we have it better than those that don't know the Lord. Sometimes we're afraid to speak the promises of God or the standing that we have in the Lord, or because we don't want to offend those that don't know the Lord. But the truth is, we do get to celebrate, and our celebration is in complete contrast to what other people get to experience. But it doesn't mean we need to hold back. It doesn't mean we need to dumb it or dull it down. It is the truth. It is what it is. And that's why our desire is to call people to proclaim the good news so that people can also experience what we get to experience. But yeah, and again, I guess it's this operating, these contrasting kingdoms. So we're in this kingdom where there's life, and and others are in this kingdom where there's death. But let's fully express and enjoy the life that we have, whilst trusting God for people to be translated out of this kingdom. And so we know then that they were then released. Very interesting thing to note is that the judgment came on the firstborns of the Egyptians. And so as they left, there are two elements to note: is that they had smeared the blood on the doorposts of their home. And as they left as Israel. That was the first time Israel actually became a nation, because they entered Egypt as the family of Jacob. Even though Jacob was named Israel, they were known only as Hebrews, not as Israelites. But when they left Egypt, it was when they were actually known as Israelites, because it was through there that there was the birth of the nation of Israel. And the final kind of part to the birth, actual fact, when you study the word Pesach, for Passover, it actually, the different words that they put together, it's the only time that word is used, kind of, or it's, they say it's a made up word specifically for that kind of event. And so the significant thing where the birth was fully realized was when they got to the sea and they crossed over the sea. That was when it was official that they became the firstborn of the Lord, right? As God speaks of Israel and say Israel is his firstborn. And so those, as someone that has 5 children and has witnessed 5 births, 2 significant flows happen in birth is that there is blood and there is water. And so that was the significance of them crossing over the water, was that it was the birth of the nation and the birth of Israel as Yahweh's firstborn. And again, after that happens, God tells them, remember, 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 and they to commemorate this moment every year. Every year they to hold a whole feast around this particular moment. And so fast forward then to the time of Jesus, where he now begins to reveal himself as the Passover lamb. And so in what had happened over the years is that the rabbis and sages had added additional elements to the Passover service or the Passover tables. It's often known as the Seder. And the Seder or the Seder, which actually means a service. It means kind of like the liturgy around that particular meal. And so along the way, rabbis added additional things to help kind of enrich and to help Israel remember this momentous occasion. And so one of the things that had been added to that was 4 cups of wine and then additional elements. But I just want to kind of zone in on these 4 cups of wine. Funnily enough, these 4 cups of wine were made up of both wine and water. It was actually a warm drink, a mix of wine and water. And so these cups were instituted by the rabbis to point to those 4 I will statements of Exodus 6. Those statements of I will call you out, I will rescue you, I will redeem you, and I will make you. And so they became these 4 cups, the first cup being the cup of sanctification for the statement of I will call you out. The second cup, the cup of deliverance for the statement of I will rescue you. Then there's the cup of redemption for the statement I will redeem you. And then the cup of praise for the statement I will make you my people and I will be your God. And so the crazy thing, what I love about this actually is that the Lord, that men added these things, because these things weren't actually commanded in scripture, but men added these things along the way. But then God comes and he partners with what men had added, which always just blows my mind. You know, that God could partner with stuff that we make and create. And he weaves, you know, his story into ours. And it's just, man, it's just such a beautiful, like, picture of incarnation, you know, kind of like the 2 worlds coming together and working together beautifully. And so then in Matthew 26, I'll read from that account, Matthew's account of the Passover. Where art thou? There we go. I'm going to read for Matthew 26:26. Now, as they were eating, Jesus took bread, and after blessing it and gave it to the disciples and said, "Take, eat. This is my body." And he took a cup. When he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink of it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." I'll pause there. And so again, this is unleavened bread. It's traditionally it's known as a matzo, and it's like this thin bread. I wish I had a piece of matzo, but anyway, you could go to a shop, find it, and you can see what matzo looks like. And it's just like this flat bread, and it's got little holes in it. It's perforated, and then it's got, because of the way it's prepared, also it's got like these darkened stripes that go across it. And so Jesus now revealing himself as the Passover lamb, and he says that, listen, take, eat, this is my body. And so now he's saying, no, I am actually, this is my body. He's personifying it, and he's saying, hey, this is my body. And then he gives it the cup. And then so in Luke's gospel, it actually says that it's after that they had eaten. And so it gives us a clue, because the Seder, it has like an order of service. So it gives us a clue that actually the cup that he raises up to them, it's the cup of redemption that he begins to share with them. And then he says, "Drink of it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant poured out for the forgiveness of sins." And then so after the cup of redemption is taken, there's one cup that is outstanding, which is the cup of praise. And that's why then in verse 29, he says, I tell you, I will not drink again of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it anew with you in my Father's kingdom. So then there's this outstanding cup that he doesn't partake of. And he says, I won't drink it until I drink it anew with you in my Father's kingdom, which is the cup of praise. But anyway, so we know that then Jesus is, after this moment, he's taken away, and then he's handed over, he's judged, he's then beaten, he's whipped. We all know how that goes. It's quite gruesome, right? And in that moment, he then becomes that bread of affliction, as that matzah, as he had said to the disciples, that this is my body. And so we know that then he is afflicted. And in Isaiah 53, we know it says he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. He was chastised, or the chastisement that brought us peace was upon him. And by his stripes, we are healed. And so again, I would encourage you, get a piece of matzah, and then you'll actually see that everything that's described in Isaiah 53 is actually there on that matzah. The holes that he was pierced, the stripes, by his stripes, you see it on the bread in the way that it's prepared, because he says that was his that was his body. And then we know then he was taken, and then he was hung on the cross. And in that moment, again, just like what had been experienced in Egypt, years back, thick darkness came over as Jesus hung on the cross, just like on the day of the original Passover. And in that moment, God's wrath began to bear down on him as he carried our sin. And he was then roasted by God's wrath, just like that Passover lamb that was to be roasted on the fire. And then he cried out to the Lord, why have you forsaken me? And we know then he gave up his last breath in that moment. And as was customary in that day, to get people down from the cross, they would break their legs so that their lungs would collapse, and then they would die instantly. And on that day, because it was a Sabbath that was about to happen because of the Passover, is that they had to get him down in a rush. And before they took him down, they pierced his side. And we know that blood and water flowed from his side. Again, blood and water always represents a new birth. And we also know it was represented in that cup, in that the cup of redemption had warm water and wine. And again, as he had said, that was the cup that it represented his blood poured out for us. And then we know that they didn't end up breaking after the soldiers saw the blood and water flowing from him. He was pronounced dead, and so they didn't end up breaking his bones, which was what was prophesied by the psalmist, that not a bone on his bone would be broken. But also, just like that Passover lamb that was supposed to be eaten whole, not a bone on it was to be broken, he fully represented that Passover lamb. And so then we know that he was buried, and then on the third day he was raised to life again. There's lots that can be said about that. In Jewish culture, let me say, the Passover represents 3 feasts. So collectively, those 3 feasts are called the Passover feasts. So you have the actual Passover, which is the Passover meal. Directly into that Passover meal is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And then straight after the Feast of Unleavened Bread is the Feast of First Fruits. And so Jesus was executed on the day of Passover as the Passover lamb. He was buried on the day of unleavened bread. And remember, unleavened bread represents a bread that's without sin, without decay. And then Jesus was then actually raised to life on the Feast of First Fruits, because as Paul teaches us, he's the firstborn among the dead. He is the first fruit of those that were born from the dead, or that were raised to life. And anyway, lots can be said of that. So all these things coincide directly with the feast that God had told Israel to remember and to commemorate every single year. So coming back, I guess, to this theme of Passover, how we approach this Passover. And particularly for me, the theme of remembrance is that this was supposed to be a feast that was celebrated every year. And when I say a feast, guys, it's a feast. It's like a whole party. You're supposed to like throw down like a solid party sponsored by the Lord, actually commanded by the Lord. Right? And basically, think about it in this way, where we have in our calendars these big moments, right? We have, I guess, many big calendar moments are like Easter, right? People have holidays around that, gather families around that, or it might be like your nation's, maybe like an Independence Day or something like that. In South Africa, we recently like celebrated Freedom Day. Or then you'll have like a Christmas, and like kind of your calendar revolves around these moments. And so for Israel, the redeemed, their calendars revolved around these moments. And so they would kind of align everything around these things. People would budget for these things. People would set aside time for these things. They would actually have to travel and go on a pilgrimage to Israel, no matter what nation they were in, to celebrate these feasts. So you can imagine every year you're mindful of this big occasion. And so it would cause them to remember because it was a massive occasion. And so again, this was a way or a means that Yahweh would cause them to train their hearts to remember what he had done for them as a people. And so you have kind of these big moments of remembrance. But also then when Jesus speaks to his disciples, he says, do this, as often as you meet, in remembrance of me. And so whenever I see this, I see like these big moments where God says, do this, have this party, but also these daily or weekly reminders as we gather as believers to also remember, so that we're constantly remembering what God has done. And back to the point of remembrance as well. It's such a key part of Scripture, which I think we miss, is that whenever God is asking us to do something or to be something, he causes us first to remember our deliverance, so that our hearts would desire to follow in his way and not feel like entitled or push back against what he's saying. But when we remember what God has done for us, it's logical for us to want to follow him and to follow his way. In Romans 12, which we often quote when we're talking about worship, Paul writes, I beseech you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer up your bodies as a living sacrifice. And so our ability to obey God or to offer up our bodies as living sacrifices hinges on our view of God's mercy. And so when we have a correct view of God's mercy, when it's like, oh, Jesus, I see what you did. Okay, it's logical for me to then follow obediently wherever it is that you take me. But if I have a warped view of God's mercy, my heart is going to war against what God wants for me. But if I'm like, completely enamored by wowed by God's mercy, then I'm going to be like, God, you're such a merciful God. Okay, whatever you want from me, I'm going to do. And so it's always preceded by God's mercy. In actual fact, when you read Exodus 20, which has what's known as the 10 Commandments, In Hebrew, it's actually the 10 words, not commandments. But in the Hebrew Bible, the first commandment or the first word is, remember that I am the Lord your God who brought you out of slavery. It isn't, you shall not have any other God before me. It is remember. That is the first word that God speaks to them. That's the first thing they're called to do, is to remember. And so, because when they remember, then they can, begin to train themselves not to have idols, or not to covet, or all these other things that are spoken. And so it always begins with this simple theme of remembrance. And so whenever we gather around the table, I guess in closing, is to remember where we come from. No matter how long we've been journeying with Jesus, no matter what he's done in and through us, is to remember that he started the journey. And that's why that statement is so, those 4 statements are so important, because God says, I will call you out. I will deliver you. I will redeem you. I will make it. It's something that God started. It's a journey that God started. He's the one that pulled us out. Whether you responded to an altar call or whatever it is, you had a counter in, by yourself in your room, it was something that God started. And so if it's something that he started, we need to take courage that he will complete it. That he will complete it. And so when we gather around the table, it's to remember that, man, God started this journey. He will take us all the way. The second thing is to remember that this is a celebration. It's a celebration of life. It's a celebration of deliverance. It's a celebration of being brought out of slavery into new life, into a journey of learning how to worship. So it needs to be a celebration. I know sometimes, we have moments of reflection and things like that, but all in all, we are supposed to be partying, even in the midst of death and decay happening around us. And so though we may see a world, that's upside down, when we gather at the table, we need to train our hearts to celebrate, regardless of what we're enduring around us, because it's supposed to be a feast. It's supposed to be a celebration. So I've learned to encourage people is to do more than just the wafer and the wine. It's like when we gather, we must eat where possible. If we're gathering as a community, we must eat. We must celebrate, because we have something to celebrate. And then the other thing is to remember is that it speaks of new birth. It was God birthing something new, and we have been made new as new creations. And again, so it's something that we're to celebrate. And so I think more so than the whole reflecting is to actually reflect before we get there. But when we get there, we celebrate. And Lord knows in this world, we need moments of celebration. And and so this is supposed to be a moment where routinely as believers, not even just kind of when we gather on a Sunday or Saturday or whenever it is that you may fellowship, but man, if you see a believer, it's just to grab that person and just say, okay, let's just quickly have this meal and just celebrate. Because we all know, man, the mission field is tough. But this is all about training our hearts to remember, no matter what it is that is happening. And so that is, I guess some of my thoughts around the Passover.
Remember. Such great basic thoughts, but really important thoughts from Langa there, helping us understand Jesus as the Passover lamb and the role of remembrance in the practice of communion. So I hope that was helpful for you. Certainly was really, really helpful for me, and I know for many of the people in the follower community. As always, please like, subscribe, share, leave comments and reviews. These things really help the podcast. Next week, we get into the final episode of our communion series, where we talk about communion as a way to build a sense of expectation for the future that we're moving toward as followers of Jesus. So here's a little clip from that episode to give you a sense of what to look forward to. Hope to see you next week.
This is why the early church is so powerful, because every time they came around that meal and they broke bread daily in their homes, every time they were meeting, and they were breaking this bread and they were drinking of this cup and they were remembering, man, something's on its way. There's a future hope to look forward to. So even if I have to be sewn into an animal skin today and catapulted over the walls of the Colosseum and martyred for my faith, I can do that, because these light and momentary afflictions are nothing compared to the eternal glory that it's on its way when the bridegroom comes to fetch the bride.
That's all for this episode of the Follower Podcast. If you found it helpful or inspiring, please consider sharing it and leaving a review on your podcast platform to help us connect with more people around the world.
If you would like to support the ministry of Follower with a monthly contribution or one-off donation, you can visit www.wearefollower.com/support.
And to say thank you, we'll send you a free copy of Live the Story, an ebook that helps you learn to share your faith with others.
Until next time, may you follow Jesus to the depths of his heart as he helps you share his love wherever you go.
From the ground beneath your feet to the very ends of the earth.